Grüß Gott und willkommen. Ich begrüße zum second hybrid talk, Subnet, this time, first time without a speaker. She is here digitally. The audience is analog. Anna Hoetjes. She's the latest artist in residence for the European Space Agency to bring some feminist perspective into space. And otherwise, she's a filmmaker and media artist. And I would like to hear all about crashes and crushes. Please.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Anna Hoetjes, an artist based in Amsterdam. I primarily work with video and performance, and increasingly with sculpture and installation. And the last years, my work revolves mostly around space science and speculative histories that I conceive based on science history and the role of women in exploring the universe specifically. So thanks for having me here. And it's been really interesting to think of lust as a theme in my work. I will approach it in a way that I will really think of you together about senses in science, what our senses mean, and how to think of embodied experiences when observing our surroundings, when doing scientific observations, and maybe more on a sort of personal level about my artistic practice, how I embrace a kind of soft, intuitive approach more and more, a kind of playfulness and speculation, in combination with a really deep interest in how science works and how science is practiced, and also the beauty of physics and math. So I'll take you on a journey through my practice. Bear with me, because I'm sort of fresh in this residency of the European Space Agency. So I'll share with you some older works, but also some newer ideas that are a bit less refined. So I'll jump a little bit from planet to planet, and I'll go from reading things to thinking out loud. So I hope you're willing to live in my world for a little bit. So I'll explore some sort of existential questions I have about science, technology, and the body. So I recently finished this residency at the European Space Agency, where I will just give you another image that relates to what I'm going to say later, but then something more interesting to look at. I finished this residency at the European Space Agency. And one of the things that I started out with in researching is spectroscopy, which is the interaction of matter with light, very shortly said, and then not just with light that we see, but the whole electromagnetic spectrum, which then says something about the chemical composition of the thing that is being observed. So it's always something that is quite complicated to explain, so I won't go into it too much, but what I really like is to think of observing as an interaction with that what we are observing. So not as a sort of pure act of we observe and that's just it. No, we interact with that what we observe. More about that later. So for a long time, I've already been interested in the power of media, and I'm fascinated with this idea of the lens as an extension, but also an alienation of the human eye. And optical technology as a gateway to seeing things we could otherwise not see. It opens up a world, but it also filters and frames a world. I'm really interested in how the development of scientific instruments steered and changed our perception over time, and also how this changed our physical relationship to our environment and to the universe and the cosmos specifically. So for a long time already, I've been interested in a period from, let's say, 1870 to 1930. I believe that many foundational scientific structures were founded in this time, and that many power relations that were put in place in this time still define how we live in society today and how we practice science today, even though a lot has changed since then. And that a very specific group of people laid these foundations. So what you see here is the Royal Society, the Royal Astronomical Society in the UK. Well, I don't have to explain maybe what I mean with a specific group of people when I show this image. And many bodies, many senses were not included in sort of the scientific structure that was being put in place at this time, or they were part of the scientific structure, but then in the beginning. So what you see here are the Harvard computers. They were a group of women that were literally computing at the Harvard Observatory around 1900. And they were processing photographic plates. So you see that the beginning of photography was actually also the beginning of data storage. So these observations could be made, could be put on photographic plates and could be analyzed afterwards. And many more observations were made, and these women were employed to process the data, and they were literally called computers. This is where the word computer comes from. So now, I'll skip this image. I will explain it later. Maybe this is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. He's one of the man that laid certain foundations for space science, but he's a very interesting figure. He was the scientist in Russia that actually sort of formulated the first realistic models to escape from Earth's gravity and to escape from the atmosphere. You see drawings here. And what I'm really interested in is the interaction between fantasy, science fiction, and speculation and science. And I believe in this period, this is very present. You hear almost any kind of pioneering rocket scientist, whether they were living in Germany, in the US, or in Russia, were saying that they were so influenced by the stories of Jules Verne, and that this actually fueled them to start thinking about how we could leave Earth. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was part of the cosmist movement, which was a movement that thought that in order to eliminate inequality, we should strive for immortality, that would, like, if death was not an issue anymore, then all humans could become equal. But that in order to, if we would achieve this, we would of course get overpopulation. So in order to solve this, we would have to colonize other planets. We would have to leave Earth and venture into space. So this is, of course, a very problematic colonial thought, but it also shows that there is this big interaction between kind of a spiritual, idealistic approach and a really, really scientific approach. And his drawings are just gorgeous. He also was a man with a disability. He was deaf. He didn't fit into society really well. He was from the countryside. And later I will show you a video in which I invented a life for his wife, a woman who, that nothing is known about. We know her name, but other than that, nothing is stored in the historical archives. And I imagined that she was the first person to venture into space. More about that later. So another interest of mine that I want to briefly touch upon is the visualization of space and how space is constructed in a way, because we need technology to observe the universe, and what we get back are stunning images of what is happening in the universe. That's, I think, often really in their aesthetics touch upon the sublime, ideas of, I don't know, almost of like a godly presence in space. It really, you know, goes back to religious aesthetics in painting, going way back. So these images are not pure representations of the universe. They are based on very factual scientific data, but they are tuned and tweaked to be as beautiful as possible. This is something that I will get back to later as well, but that I wanted to quickly touch upon. And a technique that's often used to create these images is Rgb techniques, so red, green, and blue layers. Scientific technology observes in wavelengths that our eyes can often not see, in the infrared or the ultraviolet. And the images that are taken in these wavelengths that are not visible to the human eye need to be translated to something that we can see, because otherwise, how are we going to relate to those images? How are we going to analyze them? Of course, we can analyze the pure sort of binary data of where light hits in what intensity on the sensor. But even for science, this often needs to be visualized. And this is how that is done. And this is also how these beautiful images that I just showed you are made. So I like to pull apart those images. In this little animation that I made, I do that quite simply, but I just wanted to introduce that this is something that I think about a lot. And in this little artwork that I made, it's a light box. I applied the same technique to a portrait of Margaret Lindsey Huggins. She was an astronomer from that same period, around 1900, that I mentioned before. She was a really avid scientist. She discovered many nebula, and this Rgb technique is also a technique that is often used to depict a nebula in space science. A nebula is like a dust cloud where stars are formed. I hope I say it correctly, but sort of. And she was the wife of William Huggins, who was part of the Royal Astronomical Society, of which I showed an image before of all the men in the library. But she was also already practicing science long before she met him, and continued to do so throughout their marriage. If you see this image from the front, it's black and white. From the side, it's like this. And I always imagined that her life must have been quite lonely, because her husband would go out to all these meetings, and she was not allowed to enter that. So her image is being pulled apart as a ghost coming back from history, traveling through the universe, being a nebula that maybe in hindsight we can observe again to sort of see how her position in society was. And then another thing in visualizing space is that it's this complex layering, which this image also shows you, but it's also a patching together of fragments, because sensors, they cannot see the whole filament of the sky at the same time, the same as our eyes work. We cannot see everything at the same time. So there's all these snapshots taken at different moments in time, and afterwards they're being patched together to create a whole. But that whole is an illusion in some sense, even though it is, of course, based on very scientific data. Again, just to plant this seed and show you this interest of mine. This is a really old star map by Jamison from a celestial atlas. And what I love about this image is that it shows so many layers at the same time. It shows, the night sky, very specific, detailed mathematical observations of the positions of stars. It shows navigational tools that are sort of an intermediate between the stars and our bodies, and how we can, as accurately as possible, use the stars to navigate on the sea or on Earth, for that matter. And it also shows a layer of a really long history of mythical figures assigned to constellations. And I like to think that all these layers are also still in scientific images like this, be it in a very different way, and not to denounce the accuracy of scientific observations, but that the image of space is this really complex web of cultural history, of practical navigational tools, and of really mathematical and physical observations. Another thing that I think about a lot is the fact that space, for the first time, space travel for the first time allowed us to look at ourselves from above, to have an image of Earth where the same patching together of many, many different images is happening. So we can never have one complete vision of the Earth from one eye at the same time. We always have to patch together pieces, but it has allowed us to look at ourselves from above and to have this kind of multiple vision on our body at the same time. We don't only look with our eyes and see our surroundings, we also understand our position on Earth and our position in the universe through looking at ourselves through technology from above all the time, or looking through, the camera of our phone and surveillance cameras. We are being looked at, and we look at ourselves from so many different perspectives at the same time, causing what I like to call the multiplication of the body, or the multiplication of our vision. I made a video installation called Eyes in the Sky, dealing with all these subjects. You see a still here, a still here, and a still here. This is the installation. It's two screens floating through the space. One screen resembling the gaze from Earth into space, and the other the gaze from space down onto Earth. In this video installation, I give a life to Barbara Tsiolkovsky, the wife of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky that I showed you before. She is the first person to venture into space, not using a rocket, but a balloon. I did a long project on inflatables, and the beautiful thing about a balloon is that it cannot be steered. It's you're depending on the flows of air, so you have to kind of surrender to your surroundings, and this is a way of exploring the universe that I really like. A kind of, you cannot colonize a space, you have to surrender to a space, you have to let the host take lead, is something that I say in this video, or that the protagonist says in this video. I used a lot of archival footage from the really early days of film, from the iFilm Museum in Amsterdam, but also from the European Space Agency. I used more contemporary space visualizations. I'd like to show you a little fragment of this video. It's like a 2-minute fragment. I hope
Not a single person would have believed that one day we would all pop out an eyeball from our skull and let it rise up into space. I'm Varvara Tsiolkovsky, the first person to leave her eyes in the sky. This is a mighty great glass lying upon a pit of no great depth, whereinto, if any man descend, he shall hear everything that is spoken upon the earth. If he but look into the glass, he shall see all cities, all nations as well, as if he were among them. Here I have the sight of all my friends and the whole country about. And that's when I did it. I carefully pushed the skin around my eyes, slowly squeezing my fingers between the bone and my eyeball until the eyeball popped out.
So in this work, I'll go up one slide. In this work, I really position the human senses and the body in a position of a spacecraft, in a position of a sensor observing the eye. And it also really plays with these sort of classical exploration narrative of someone venturing into a new space, threading unthreaded ground, so to say. And also features really, really old science fiction stories, you know, almost, yeah, a combination between mythical and sci-fi stories. So I propose that a world in which, the human body is really part of the environment that it is exploring. Even if this is, of course, physically impossible, but what if we think of that environment in that way? So after this, I started making a more installational and sculptural piece featuring a balloon that has actually been in space. In the early 80s, two balloons drifted through the atmosphere of Venus to collect scientific data. So I made a replica of this balloon. This is a really early version of that balloon. In reality, the balloon was much smaller, but this was the first image that I encountered of this project. And under the balloon, I hung an instrument, a sculpture, that really closely resembled the gondola, the instruments that were floating through the atmosphere of Venus, but also referring back to color techniques and spectroscopy techniques that were used by early female astronomers, and by, you know, many different astronomers, but female astronomers really digested a lot of data acquired with this technique. And I made an audio piece where I combined an interview with this French space scientist that was part of the actual mission with a speculative story that was voiced by a young female musician called Pink Oculus from Amsterdam. And in this story, a sort of secret society of women from all cultures on Earth has secretly traveled into space for centuries already, exploring the universe from this really holistic perspective, that they are part of what they research, and they, they would never colonize the territory that they enter, but they bring back traces from the universe to Earth, and they also leave traces behind, maybe, of, what they did. So this device becomes a kind of speculative device that scans the surface of Venus and the universe for traces or proof of this secret female society. I continued with my fascination for Venus, and as an artist, I use a lot of data that has been collected in space, but I have a very different relationship to these databases, of course. My starting point is often visual, but then I'm really interested in how those visuals came into being. What are the techniques behind it? Why are things visualized the way they are? I often make use of the many different stages of translating data into visuals, and also how the snapshots of data, how fragmented they can be. So these images are radar images of the surface of Venus. I love how they are they're pulled separate from the planet almost. They're these free floating squares of mountain ridges. They don't have a base. They become a light sheet of paper. And you know, they're just planets on their own floating through the universe. So I started to make them out of ceramics and applied temperature scales to them that were also applied to the original scans of the surface of Venus. And to me, these become really tactile, almost sensuous, physical objects, almost referring to the inside of a human body. And these objects, they carry a lot, like a really layered information of what color means, what tactility and soil means, of what clay means, of what scanning and then transferring it back to a surface means. And I also presented them as these sort of free floating squares in a universe. And the other work that you see in the front here is called The Dust of Venus, is based on data, like chemical samples taken from the surface of Venus. So there were landers on Venus that survived a very short amount of time and sent data back to Earth. And based on those samples, I started mixing clay and making really big clay tablets that had a really strange composition, because the balance of chemicals is quite different than normal clay. And they turned into this, and the inscriptions on them refer back to ancient star maps, really thinking back of what it meant to lie down on the ground in the dust, look up at the sky and observe the movements of the night sky, and from these observations determine our own position on Earth, our own position in the universe, and help us navigate on the surface of Earth. And also I specifically looked at observations of Venus from these times. So yeah, I can talk about this for a long time, but I want to kind of jump to my research at the European Space Agency. So I hope you have a nice idea of my world, my fascinations, my artistic methods, the questions that I have about how we look at space and how we construct an image of space, and how, for me, I can make that tactile, how I can bring space to the human body and make us enable the viewers of my work to have a more physical relationship to space. So there were two things that really stuck with me while researching imagery at the European Space Agency and talking to many, many scientists who really generously shared their knowledge with me and had most of the time a really open mind to think with me about my questions. And funnily enough, they are related to spectroscopy techniques that I spoke about before, but they kind of took a whole different direction. So one thing that really fascinated me is there's one database that scientists use to bring together all astronomical observations of the whole filament, of the whole night sky, so to say. And first of all, I'm amazed that such a database exists because it's quite complex. But as I was going through it, some things struck me, and I'm going to show you this in a second. So first of all, to explain this image a bit, the stars that you see in the background is in optical light. So that's a wavelength of light that we can see, that our eyes are sensitive to. And all these shapes that you see are footprints of scientific instruments. So any spacecraft or any observatory on Earth, but I think these are mostly spacecraft, they have sensors in them, and these sensors can observe certain patches of sky at the same time. So actually, the shapes that you see here are the sensors that are in a certain grid inside a space telescope. So these are the footprints, and by clicking on it, you can see the observations that were done by that sensor at that moment, and you can get all the data from it. But in the background, you also see the night sky as seen by a certain instrument in a certain wavelength. So this is optical, but you see here the night sky as seen through infrared, where you see it looks completely different. There's a lot of patches, a lot of emptiness, and also the fact that far infrared is displayed in this color. Then you have submillimeter, which is displayed like this. So you see, it's the area that is covered is fairly similar. Then you have radio waves. Then you have mid-infrared, which is described here as blue. So I'm sure there are reasons for displaying the infrared wavelengths like this in this color, but there's not really clear rules. Or when I ask, like, okay, so why is this blue? It's just a decision that someone made at some point to visualize it like this. As long as the data can be extracted from it, it doesn't really matter. You also see sort of the patchwork of where the sensor has been and how it's been aligned together. This is ultraviolet. You see completely different blind spots, completely different patches of what is covered. This is dust, as seen by Planck. This is X-ray. So you see how the same part of the sky is this really complex web, this really complex layering of so many different visions. It's not one vision. And for me, this is really beautiful. For me, this shows the kind of richness of how we observe and how technology observes for us, but also how there is never one way to look at the universe, and how beautiful it is to think of patching, layering, and leaving some points blank, and how there's many different footprints and many different, I mean, this is just one shot that I kept to make clear how this is the same spot of the sky. But of course, if I go through the whole filament, I mean, it's mind-boggling how many observations are done there. So with the kind of work that female astronomers have done in the early days of space science in the back of my mind, and the idea that I want to have this really physical relationship to the construction of the universe, I started thinking of how to make textile works of the filament of the sky. So how to literally sew, weave, and embroider together all these complex, layered ways of modeling and analyzing and observing the night sky, which, I mean, it's also interesting to think that we cannot actually have this physical relationship to the night sky anymore most of the time, because at least in the Netherlands, there is pretty much not a properly dark sky. There's a few islands where you can experience a really dark sky, but the rest is so light polluted. I mean, you can look on there's these dark sky maps and just go to the Netherlands to see how bright it is. So I hope for you that Austria is a bit better, but I think the whole of Europe is fairly light polluted. And it's so hard to have a relationship to the universe and the cosmos. Anyway, to have an embodied physical relationship to it, because it's so abstract and so far away, and we're so not used to needing that dark sky anymore. What I'm thinking about is how can I use my artistic methodologies to kind of invite people to have this embodied relationship to the night sky in this world that we live in this world where it's really hard to be in nature and just see the night sky, and also in a world where we need, if we're scientists, we use our own senses less and less, whereas the origin of science is, of course, very directly just using our own senses to observe and analyze our surroundings. It's very similar to art. I mean, art is also using sensory experiences to understand our surroundings, but it uses different methodologies and different strategies to do so. So while being at the European Space Agency, I also started to think of movements more and more. How movement can help us relate to the technology that is around us all the time. So just to think back of this image of the night sky, how instruments are floating actually amongst the stars in this image. Fantasy and mythology are floating amongst the stars. And how can we bring that back, so to say? I started to think of spacecraft because as sort of maybe I should show the next image. So I started to think of the movements around us, the movements that stars make, the movements that our planet makes, the movement that we on the surface of Earth make, and how all this navigation and all this movement is so connected. And how, compared to the early days of looking up at the night sky, amongst the stars are all these spacecrafts moving constantly and continuously. And these spacecrafts are moving in very specific patterns. They move from really sort of simple circular patterns to super, super complex patterns. And I find it beautiful how everything, like nothing is not moving in the universe. Everything is always moving. So how do you define relative movement? Physics and math actually allow us to and this is pure beauty. But in order to have a physical relationship to this, I started to think of these spacecrafts as performing rituals for us in space. They're performing really patient, meditative rituals constantly. And they are our eyes and our senses in space. So in order to give you a bit of an idea, this is Gaia, who is a spacecraft that's mapping the movements of all the stars in our Milky Way. And this is the scanning pattern of the Milky Way that the instruments of Gaia make. It's just, you know, these mathematical patterns that are absolutely stunning. And that for me refer back to, these sort of mandalas and quite spiritual drawings as well. Another image is Integral that has been deployed over many, many years. So you see on the top, it started in 2003 or 2004, and it just patiently moves in this really meticulous pattern to help us understand gravitational waves, I think. Oh my God, I hope I say this correctly now. What each spacecraft has in common, that its movements are really tedious, repetitive, and they are patient. So I think these movements that are based on this sort of mathematical essence of movements, they're really utterly simple and utterly complex at the same time. I started to think of them as meditations, as rituals, and as being transcendent, just as a tool for me to connect to those spacecrafts in a physical way. So what if we think of our own movements as being related to the movements of spacecrafts constantly? What if we, can we try to move in sync with those spacecrafts, especially scientists who work on those spacecrafts and, you know, they analyze data on their computer screen all the time, but what is their relationship to those spacecrafts that they actually worked on, and the technology, you know, let's not forget that technology is produced by human bodies, or the technology that produces technology is produced by human bodies. Technology is never separate from us. We make those instruments, we make the things that look for us. We're not separate from them. So can we see our movements as a kind of projection of those spacecraft movements, or can we imagine a line between ourselves and a spacecraft, just each moving our own way, but still being related? Tomorrow, actually, I will do an experiment with scientists from the European Space Agency to see if we can draw these movements, and then later on we move to the beach so close to where they work every day to see if we can somehow perform the repetitive movements of the spacecrafts and trace their movements in the sand. So in order to create a small moment of connection with all the instruments that are observing the universe for us, and how humans build those instruments, and how we are all parts of all that we observe in a very direct, embodied way, I'd like to ask you right now to stand up. Those of you who are in the space, if you are behind a computer screen, maybe you can stand up and look out of a window or something. I don't see all of you right now, but just, you know, you can look away from each other so it's not awkward. And then try to really adjust your eyes to a distance much further away than a screen. And do some really simple exercises with me. So just breathe in and out really slowly. Observe the space around you. And listen to the sounds around you. And become aware of how you understand the space around you. Think of the experiences you had throughout your life that inform your understanding of your surroundings. So think of the data that is stored in your muscles, in your nerves, in your eyes, in your ears, in your skin, and how all that data helps you to understand where you are and how you move. So let that sink in for a little while. Then think of the air outside of the building that you are in right now. And think of how the air that you breathe in Austria is actually connected to the air that I breathe in my studio in Amsterdam right now. Breathe in that air through your nose. Let it go through your lungs. Let the oxygen float through your whole body. And breathe out again. Feel your feet on the floor. And think of the soil underneath the building that you are in right now. And think of how we could walk together to each other from Austria to Amsterdam if only we were fit enough and patient enough. How the soil under our feet is always connected. Then think of the whole earth on which we are spinning around patiently towards the sun, away from the sun, towards the sun and away from the sun. Day, night, since so long ago and for so much longer. Think of the speed with which the earth flies through the space around the sun and how the gravity of our earth and the atmosphere hold us all together. Think of the speed of the sun moving through the universe, and that universe is always and always expanding. And think of all the spacecrafts patiently moving along with all those movements between us and the sun and even further, performing their repetitive rituals without complaint. The instruments sensing the rawest of signals in the brutal conditions of space, storing data in their nervous systems, transmitting it to us. So as we are all standing here right now, all connected through the incredible technology of our computers, internet fibers, data centers, and wireless signals, all made with minerals and elements that have been compressed and formed by the universe, by processes so long that our senses can never fathom them, and that we extract that matter from Earth to enable human connection and exchange and to enable observations through technology, observations throughout the universe. But that apart from that technology, we are all also still just simply connected through rock, compost, water, air, and gravity. So I hope that your body now somehow inhabits the many movements it always takes part in. We are not separate from the environment that we observe, and we are not separate from the spacecrafts and the technology we observe with. We are always part of the technological movements and the movements that we ourselves add to the universe. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me start. Who would like to ask the first question? Okay, then I would guess I will start. For you as a visual artist, Anna, how did your experience change your perspective? Did you think about those things ahead of time, or were you engulfed in those thoughts when you were doing your artist residency at the space agency?
So maybe I stop sharing my screen so you can actually see me. Well, yes and no, of course. I think many of these thoughts, as I hope I showed you by showing like works that I worked on throughout the years, were with me for a long time already. And if you look back at even earlier works, you see that, I worked a lot with the body and with performance and with sort of the relationship between the individual body and the collective, or between the individual body and technology and media. So these are not completely new thoughts for me, but I think what I discovered throughout this residency is, how important those strategies are for me in relationship to science specifically. And that, that this really has an added value. And that also it's important to not maybe justify your artistic practice in scientific ways, but that you can add your artistic practice to scientific methodologies.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, sorry. Looking the wrong way.
Hi, Anna. Thank you for your talk. You mentioned a lot that you look at scientific data differently than the scientists that you work with or that surround you in your residencies. Does that different perspective on the data sometimes also lead to new experiences on the end of the scientists? Or is it more of a one-way direction towards you?
Well, I think it's a bit early to tell, maybe. I think what I did during the residency also is start a reading group to read quite sort of critical theoretical art texts that are often irritating to scientists, I think, or confusing. It's also definitely language that scientists are not used to read. It also makes you aware how within the arts and within the whole theoretical framework of the arts, we learn to speak a certain language. But once you can translate that language and translate the questions and the sort of wondering that is behind that, it leads to very interesting discussions. And I do think it leads to new perspectives with scientists, as far as I learned. And I think this kind of embodied experience is something that scientists also really long for very often. So that I will give this workshop tomorrow, so I cannot really say how it will be for scientists, but that sort of allowing you to let go of this scientific logic as a scientist can be very liberating. And then afterwards, indirectly probably feeds into how you observe maybe. But I also realized that, yeah, it's okay for me to not know how this influences scientists directly, that it maybe is not so measurable or quantifiable, and this might seep in really slowly, or this might result in something years from now, or it might change something in their personal life and not necessarily in their professional life. And that's all valuable to me as well. But I think it does probably change something.
Thank you. One next question.
Thank you very much for the talk. I think you were talking a lot about experiencing data and understanding it maybe correctly, or like grasping it correctly. But it also seems to me like it's this old problem between separating maybe body and mind. So do you, with this whole idea of lenses and looking at ourselves from outside, do you have do you want to share what you think about how this relationship between body and mind is, how you see this difficult?
No, yeah, I mean, it's a very valid question that indeed I think about a lot. And I think, yeah, I have this kind of hope or idea that it, like the whole of society is thinking about this more and more, maybe. Yeah, the fact that what I try to ask you when you think of all the data that is stored in your muscles, in your nerves, in your senses, is that we experience and analyze through our whole body, and that that it's really tricky to think that we can replace that whole experience purely by technology, because yeah, technology is a very different way of sensing. And how can we have that really valuable technological perspective that allows us to see so much more and to realize so much more than we could without technology, but to also keep relating back to our own body and the lived experiences that yeah, make that we understand our surroundings in a certain way, and that we observe not only with our eyes and ears, but with many, many different things in our body. Yeah, so this is, of course, the idea that the ratio is trustworthy, that we need to have this analytical view in order to perform science, where even though I don't want to say that the analytical take is not important, but there's also this other more sensory approach that helps us understand things. And I think it's really important to keep relating back to that, and to not see that as dangerous noise that always has to be removed, or as something subjective, or something that should be filtered out in order to get to the core of something. Very often that what is filtered out is also important. So that's maybe the best explanation I can give you right now.
Hello, thank you for your fantastic presentation and amazing work. I have a question related to resolution. I'm sure you're familiar with the practice of Rosa Mencken. And how do you deal with the level of resolution with all these massive amounts of data? How do you, going back to the question of filtering, you decide how this is relevant to your research and you don't miss something? Thank you.
Wow, it's a good question that I'm not sure I ever thought about that directly. So first of all, I think missing things is not necessarily a problem for me as an artist. I think that's also the freedom I have as an artist compared to a scientist. And that resolution is for me maybe another layer to think of in visualizations, that you have all these different gradaties in Dutch, you would say, like these different levels of resolution and distance, and how they each give their own layer of information, and how this is a complex web on top of each other. But thanks for raising it. It's not something that I applied that directly to my practice at the moment, but it's something that maybe I will think about a bit more now.
I think we have time for one more question. Are there any more questions? Yeah, please, Marius.
I don't see you now. It's nice to see you.
Are you sure that nobody else wants to ask a question? Then you go. No, my question is like, in your introduction, you mentioned speculative realities.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one real reality and everything else is speculative, or aren't we all living in a speculative reality? I mean, this is a question you don't have to ask, because other more important questions are I'm sure there are other more important questions.
That is precisely how I like to think of things. That I often go back in history, and I create a speculative history, because I think the history that is being told is also speculative in some way. So I feel completely free to create my own speculative history or reality, or I think that, I mean, it's not as simple as that, but as an artist, I do like to think of reality and speculation in that way, that they are, I feel freedom to play with that completely.
Okay, then I have one last question for you, because then when you voice the complexity of all the data you've been observing and you've been working with, I just recently read something about that arts and science actually come from the same corner. So once the complexity increases such an extent as you just described, to what extent do you think that actually art and science is meeting back in the same corner? Because like really, where does interpretation stop and where the facts end? It's really very confusing from my point of view.
Yeah. No, I mean, but that confusion is the beauty, right? I mean, to embrace that confusion for me is something that I feel is also the value of an artistic practice. In science, you kind of have to align things. You have to match data to get to a kind of core, and there where it doesn't match is where it gets interesting, both in science and in art. But in science it gets interesting because you're like, hey, it doesn't match, what's wrong? How could I do different research to see how I could make it match? And for me, my artistic practice is very much about, hey, it doesn't match, how beautiful that this sort of, all these different perspectives don't match. They just don't, and they don't have to. And to embrace the fact that observations don't always have to match, and that each observation carries their own importance and their own knowledge in them. And in that way also, I also like to think that there's many knowledge systems, and that many, our way of practicing science is one way to observe and analyze the laws of nature. But of course, there's many, many ways to observe and analyze the laws of nature that are maybe more spiritual, but for me, not less grounded or not less valuable. So I'm not sure if I can answer your question. This is just a way I think I started to think of working with science as an artist. And I like to think that we as scientists and artists deal with observation and the senses and lived experiences in many ways.
Those are outstanding closing words. Thank you very much for your time and for this really outstanding talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So if you're interested, also, you can, of course, check, social media, my website.
We post it all.
Sorry, you post it all. Yeah.
We post it.
No, but more like, and also don't always reach out if you have more questions, or if you ever want to get in contact. It's always nice to hear back from people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon. Bye bye.
I don't hear you anymore, but thank you for the applause.
You didn't hear you didn't hear your applause. I'm very sorry for that.
I saw it, which was
you saw it. Very good.
Experience as well.
Thank you very much again.
Bye bye.
Have a great evening. Bye bye.